There's a lack of clarity on the ICP. There's a lack of clarity on what different personas or different ICPs might want, what value means to them. And that makes it very hard to guide people to set value if you don't know what it is.
Welcome to Experiment Nation's podcast. I'm your host, Charlotte Bamford. Today, we have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Elsa Vanderberg, who has worked on product management for B2B SaaS startups and scale-ups. So, Dr. Elsa, would you be able to tell us more about you and your work experience?
Sure. So I've been working in tech for about 15 years, and I think I think 8 of those have been in product management in various different roles. And I've been a solopreneur, as they call it, for the last 2 years, which means that I've worked with a variety of B2B SaaS startups and scale-ups in particular. Many of them pre-product market fit. Some of them thinking they have product market fit, but not quite having it. So kind of in that space. And I focus very much on helping product teams become more outcome driven and evidence backed. So move from the classical feature factory to trying to achieve outcomes, understanding which outcomes they should be driving, and figuring out good strategies to be doing that. So that's been my focus for the last 2 years.
Wow, that's amazing. So you have your own business, kind of like a consultancy type of thing? Or?
Just me. It's just me.
It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very tiny consultancy. So I wouldn't call it. So I do some advising. I do some coaching. My preferred way of working is as an interim. Because I like really jumping in, getting my hands dirty. So having at least 20 hours a week with the company is the best for me, even though I also do some advising on the side. But of course, then I can get a lot less proactive, right?
Yeah, it's really good.
Do the work.
Yeah, it's actually really good, kind of like fits some of our lifestyle nowadays, the beauty of digital work, right? So anyway, I'm curious because I want to know how, like for us who are not in the product management area, how does a day in your life look like?
Well, it depends a lot on the organization and on my role within that organization.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to think back about the last project I worked for, which was actually very different from the project before. So it depends, right? Sometimes I'm brought in to lead existing product teams. So it's more like scale-ups. They have already a pretty decent tech department, a product department, and I'm there to create structure and also maybe to up-level that product team that is there. But in the last case, I actually joined a very early stage startup where there were 0 product people, and I was the first product person to kind of take over from a founder. Where, of course, then my work is way more individual contributor and very close to the leadership team, trying to create leadership alignment. So that, of course, heavily impacts what my day looks like. In any case, there's always a lot of customer contact. That sounds very blah and boring and like repeating what everyone says. But I spend about, well, depending on the role, right? But in the last IC role, I spent about 50-60% of my time talking to customers or audience members, talking to somebody, exactly. So somebody outside of the company.
So this is kind of like creating an MVP first and then putting that out in the market and then eventually finding out what the user behavior is before uplifting that product. Is that what you're trying to?
Yeah, so it depends. Like it really depends, right? I hate this answer, but it depends on the maturity stage of the company. But what I often see is I'm brought into a company, they have a product out there. I'm often brought in to optimize this existing product. So they say, hey, we have a problem with our customer activation rates. Can you come in and tackle our onboarding flow, tackle our new user experience, get them to value more quickly, and then it's going to be great. And then I come in and I quickly realize that the problem isn't the onboarding journey. The problem is that we don't really know what the value is. Right? It's like another B2B SaaS product. It is a sea of B2B SaaS products. There's no clear competitive differentiation. There's a lack of clarity on the ICP. There's a lack of clarity on what different personas or different ICPs might want, what value means to them. And that makes it very hard to guide people to set value if you don't know what it is. So I'm often brought in with a pretty simple mandate, and then it becomes quite complicated in the end. It becomes this question of who are we serving and what is it that they want, right? Like what strong recurring pain point is still open for them that is currently unsolved, because we tend to stumble upon pain points that have already been solved.
Oh, that's true though. Yes.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a big part of good qualitative research is like digging a little bit deeper, because when you do a lot of interviews or a lot of moderated user tests or any of the qualitative methods that I use, people will give you a lot of pain points.
That's true.
But then if you prod deeper, right, and ask the right questions, you can figure out whether these are really strong pain points,
Yes.
or just
they're
kind of
just
nice to
complaining.
have.
Yes.
Yeah. And have they not already solved them?
Yeah.
And also for me, a good question is always like, have you tried solving it before? Because often it's like, nah. And then it's kind of a hint that maybe they don't really care, right? There might be exceptions to that. So I think there's a lot of looking for that hook still, that angle still in the companies that I work with, which is a few steps before even delivering a good MVP, right? And it's definitely many steps before running an A/B test where you have a very concrete idea. It's going to be A or B, right? We're often not there yet. In more mature companies, we are there, right? Or maybe that's like the fifth test that we layered upon other tests. But yeah, there's no one size fits all answer, unfortunately.
That's true. It is kind of like difficult. But do you have like, I know that there's no one size fits answer, but do you have like a general type of process that you follow in terms of like when you go into a company, what's the very first thing that you always do? And then from there, you go through the other processes or steps. Like, how would that look like?
Yeah, so this is the beauty of being able to kind of have this same mandate over and over, right?
Yes.
You do develop kind of a framework or a process.
Yes.
And the first thing I do always is I do one-on-ones with leaders of different departments to kind of see where we are at, but one-on-one, not in a group setting, because I want to get, right? I want to see the differences, and I always find big discrepancies between important discrepancies between the leaders of
really
different
interesting.
departments.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Romo Santiago from Experiment Nation. If you'd like to connect with hundreds of experimenters from around the world, consider joining our Slack channel. You can find the link in the description. Now back to the episode.
And one of the key things I look for is asking, who is the ICP, right? Who are we selling to? Who are we building for? Who are we messaging to?
Yeah.
Which I think is fundamental to everything else, right? It's not a marketing problem.
Yeah.
It underpins everything we do, right? Who's it for? So that's why step one, I always find discrepancies there. So I do a lot of work there in figuring out whether we can have more focus there, right? And how we can best describe or define this ICP. And where we need to create alignment and where it's maybe fine if we don't have alignment, right? Maybe sales can do something slightly different from product, but we need to make this explicit. So that's like step one.
Yeah.
And step two is understanding what is the core value to them, right? Like, and what is it? What are we doing?
Yeah. Do you think that most of the time, most companies have not, like, especially startups, right? Because again, it's a startup. Do you find that most of their ICPs are not defined? And that's basically, that may be one of the reasons why you're there to help them define them, or?
So they're often defined because a lot of people have read the books or looked in their LinkedIn feed and they've heard that you should define an ICP, right? So often they are defined.
Okay.
The question is whether they are well defined, right? There's a variety of problems. One is to have a very broad ICP, to just say, we're going to serve e-commerce shops.
Sure.
Which is super broad, right? That's not really an ICP, that's not narrow at all. And especially when you're just starting out, when you're a startup or a scale up, I think you should be a lot more narrow than that, because this is basically not having an ICP at all, because it's a lot. Another one is, of course, having different departments working with different ICPs and not knowing this of each other, not being aware of this, because it is sometimes fine, right? Sometimes I have founders or sales departments who are trying to sell more upmarket and product selling more for a medium tier, or building more for a medium tier. And this can be okay if we have clear agreements about this, but often they don't know from each other that they're serving completely different ICPs. Problem. And then I see also ICP descriptions that are quite random, where it was more like, okay, people told us we should describe our ICP. we'll just have a 1-day brainstorming session. We'll bring the leadership team together, right? And it's going to be
just
great.
one
There'll be
whole group.
coffee
I
and
agree.
cake.
Yes.
And we wrote something down, and it's narrow and it's cool. And we wrote this down, and then it went into our knowledge base. And now we have an ICP, right? And that's also not really how it works, right? You want it to be evidence-based. You want it to be iterative. It definitely has to be a living document, right? You can't just like park it somewhere, and it should not be just a random fence just to be done, like check off the homework. And I see a lot of ICP descriptions that focus around certain attributes. In B2B, it's often about region, company size, revenue, right? And I understand that these are nice attributes to work with because you can easily distill a list, right? You can find a list of people who fit those attributes online, and then sales can start harassing them, for example. Right?
It's a good term.
But usually it's not that those are usually not the most important attributes to describe your specific ICP, right? Maybe it's more about the specific pain point that they are looking for, or it's about a specific persona that's in there, or it's a different way that the company is run, or it's about the tech stack that they use. So there might be different attributes that are actually much more relevant for you to describe your ICP than company size. So it feels a bit like this kind of hammer approach to defining an ICP, which is not the best one. So problems.
So that's true. But having a narrow ICP means that also, because narrow also means a small data. So on that perspective, how do you deal with that small amount of data? Because again, like we're about to delve into like experimentation and the product management role that you have. How do you usually how does it look like? How does experimentation look like in your role? And especially you are dealing with, like you said, a narrow ICP. Would that involve personalization?
I don't know what you mean by would that involve personalization. What do you mean exactly with that?
So in terms of like the tests that you run would be specific for that group only, or what would look like?
Yes. So the whole reason why I care so much about narrowing down the ICP, and I want the entire company aligned on that, right? I want the leadership team to at least maybe not align, but agree with that. This is what we're doing now, right? And we will keep revisiting it, but this is what we're testing now. This is the one we're going for at least this quarter. All in. And because my discovery and experimentation work will also focus on only that ICP. I will not go outside of it. I'm very bullish on that, right? And this is something where teams get lax, especially when you are relatively early stage and you struggle to find participants. I see that teams are just happy that somebody signed up for the test, right? They're happy to get a participant, and they are less strict on whether this participant fits the ICP. And that's, to me, very important. I think one of the biggest mistakes that teams make, because in the end you end up collecting a lot of noise. You get feedback from people who do not fit your ICP, who you're not building for, and you're led astray, right? So that's something I push quite a lot on. And I think when, again, in an early stage setting, startup, scale up, you are best off going quite niche in the beginning, right? I'm like one of a million people who are saying this, right? I'm not going to stray too much on that, but if you try to build for everyone, it's going to be quite mediocre for everyone, right? You need to be quite specific on who you're building for. So, but then the discovery work also has to focus on these people and not anybody else, right? You have to be very strict with yourself there.
I agree. Now, what are, again, like you've mentioned, there are a lot of noises that would come along with some of the testings or, the product management process. What are those common challenges that you face with during the testing or during the prototyping period or, during user testing? And how would you usually get past it?
Yeah. So I think one of the most common challenges that we don't talk about enough is that we struggle to find enough participants.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Really, like this is very, very hard, especially if you want to test with customers. So people who are already using your product who fit your ICP, right? So you have two filters already. They have to be customers. There's a fit your ICP, and they have to say yes to being a participant. So then you already have like hardly anybody left. I've seen their statistics, so I'm a big fan, or I rely a lot on Teresa Torres's work, and I'm also part of her community where people talk to each other about their general statistics that they get when they're sending out an email blast to customers asking them to participate in interviews, and how many people actually show up for an interview. And it's a steep drop off, right? And this is quite depressing for teams because they're all excited to start with talking to customers within their ICP.
Exactly.
And they can't get anyone on the phone. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is then getting enough data where in qualitative terms, I think if I have conversations with 10 or 15 people, I can already get quite a bit of signal out of that in a good case, right? So like that's if I had a narrow ICP. If I didn't, if I went quite broad, there will be no patterns because there will be like a wide variety of people who have wide variety of problems. So it's going to be really hard to detect patterns. And the third big issue is distinguishing signal from noise, right? So understanding, what are they just kind of complaining about, but they don't really care, right? What actually will move the needle? So it's kind of those things. But the beauty is that you can layer a variety of test methods upon each other, right? Because it is super uncertain. It is, right, 10 to 15 people is nowhere near statistically significant. You have to kind of gauge whether they really mean it or not, right? There's like a lot of gut feeling involved in
I agree.
test, in discovery and validation. But that's okay for me because I layer, it's not just one test, right? First I'll do interviews, but then I will do maybe a landing page test. Then I might do a moderated user test. Then I might do a prototype, right? I'll just, for the same assumptions, they will go through a variety of tests that will build my certainty.
Would you use the same people that you interviewed in to go through the landing page tests and the other tests? Yep.
Yeah, it depends on the case, right? But I have done that in the past because sometimes, for example, I've also done moderated user tests with the first version of the product, the old version of the product, and then moderated user tests with a new version of the product. And then sometimes it's very interesting to do that with the same people who have seen both versions, and you can see how their response is different, right? They might respond way more fiery to the second thing, and they will also tell you like, whoa, this is so much better than the first thing. And that gives me something, of course.
Yep. I was also about to ask that question that you've touched on earlier. How do you make sure that the findings from your user moderated test are actionable items? Like, how would you define something that would move a needle?
That depends a lot on the target audience.
Yeah. Do you
really,
have like an example, or like?
Yeah. So one thing that came to mind just now, I used to, the product I built before was a project management tool, which was sold to project managers and founders at agencies, for example. And with them, I really found that if they haven't looked for a solution, right, they're not gonna be interested in buying it. They have to have. So I would ask them, okay, can you walk me through the last time you did XYZ, and kind of prod for the pain points that they experienced in that process, right? So I'm trying to outline the steps on their job map, like what are they doing step by step, and what are the pain points associated to each step. And then for each of those, I try to figure out, have you ever really tried solving that? Like, have you looked for a solution? And I found for this particular audience, that was very important because they're the kind of people who, if they didn't go out and look for a solution, they're not going to care if you present them with a solution, right? But then I switched. I worked for a different company that built a developer tool, where this didn't work at all, right? Because I kept asking, of course, like a similar process, and then asking, have you looked for a solution? And often they said, I haven't. Okay. But then they had switched to different tools that they read about on Hacker News that just looked shiny and cool, right? They just said, oh, this looks shiny and cool. They started using it and they stuck with it forever, which is a way of working which does not fit the old targeted audience at all, but it is something that happened in this target audience. So then I have to, of course, adapt how I interpret the things that they say based on behavior that I've seen for this particular target audience. So there's no one size fits all answer.
That's true.
It really
though.
depends on like how this specific target audience seems to tick, and you can figure that out by talking to them and watching them.
That's really, really interesting. Now, I think the other question is like, do you have touch on gut feel? Because again, like because it is a narrow set of audience, how do you usually remove having that objective outlook in that specific product versus the subjective? So, like, how does your empathy play a role in the things that you do?
Yeah. So I'm going to be brutally honest. It's pretty subjective what I do, right? Like there is no truth, there is no spoon, there is no real objectivity. Because even then when I talk to people, I have to interpret in this moment, do I believe what they say, right? How serious do I think they are? What is really important, that there's so many layers underneath, right? You try not to reach, you try to take what people say and how they react at face value. But there is a lot of interpretation, of course. There has to be a lot. And then also with qualitative tests, right? I do maybe 30 interviews. I do 10 usability tests. I do 10 moderate user tests. It's low numbers, right? So there's a lot of kind of making sense of that small amount of data. So kind of putting a puzzle together. And there is so much subjectivity in that. So for me, this idea of saying evidence-based eradicates subjectivity or gut feeling or opinion, nonsense. And I've also worked with so I'm quite a fan of collecting evidence, right? But I love working with people who operate with a strong conviction. So for example, I really like that, like especially people who are very experienced, right? And they're not throwing it out. It's like, no, I just think it should be like this. But they say, I feel like this is wrong, right? So I can present them with all of this data and I say, look, this is the signal that I see. And here, how is it supported? Here's my opportunity solution tree. Look how heavy is this branch? How many insights are here? This seems to really be it. There seems to be something here. But then I'll work with somebody who says, I don't think so. Like based on just my knowledge and my background, right? So I'm convinced it's the other thing where we don't have that much evidence. I really feel like there's something there. Can we dig more there? And I quite enjoy working in this kind of difficult environment, right? Where it's not like, because you can't blindly follow the evidence. That would be too simple. There is a lot of out of the box thinking, questioning, critical assessment of what you find, right? So I quite enjoy having these conversations and saying, no, we're going to keep exploring the thing where we have more insights, or yes, let's dig there, even though we don't have many insights, but maybe there is something there. It's not an exact science. Is what I'm trying to say.
I agree with you. Like, I think, like, the best analogy that I can think about is like when you're interviewing like crimes and stuff, like evidences based, there will always be a gut feel, and there will always be, while perspectives are different, there will always be one thing that would be similar out of all the stories that would come out, and that, like, it may be subjective, but it would come out of your gut feel as well, that you are on the right path on finding out what the problem is.
And it's not like a magic formula, right? Like
exactly,
I really like,
it's not.
I like Rory Sutherland's thinking on this quite a lot from Ogilvy, this big marketing agency. He wrote a book, Alchemy, and then the title is longer, but starting with Alchemy. And he talks a lot about this kind of creativity and the fact that running a business, it's not like you follow a formula, right? No. You follow this process step by step by step, and it spits out the answer. Because if that were the case, everybody would be building the same products, right?
Exactly.
It's not how it works. There is a lot of moonshots and creativity and thinking out of the box and doing unexpected things.
Exactly. Question probably, I think this is another good question. How would you handle conflicting feedback or opinions from different users during a testing?
So it depends, like, of course, assuming they're all from the same ICP, right? This is not uncommon. And I think even within your ICP, there's also always segmenting to be done. So it's very interesting to understand is there, like, I always ask profiling questions to begin with to try to
Mm,
understand, to be able to segment them, and to
okay.
try to understand why is it different for this person than for this person. It doesn't mean that it's not valid anymore. It's just that there's maybe something else that they're doing or something in their background that makes something excruciatingly painful for customer A, but not painful at all for user customer B, right? And
Yeah.
it's my job to try to understand what is the difference between them, like why is that, so that I can segment them even smaller, and maybe I'll find within my ICP an even smaller, like beachhead underserved segment that is even more interesting.
Okay, awesome. I think like we're almost out of time, but I just want to know, like, for someone who is just starting in the field, um, who wants to go into product management or something that you do, what would you what would be your advice on how to master the techniques that you have? Like, what's the first place that they need to go? Who do they need to listen? Of course, they have to listen to Dr. Elsa Vanderberg, but aside from Dr. Elsa Vanderberg, who else? So, what would be your advice?
So I think for me, I've learned the most on the job, right?
Yes.
So I like this advice of, like, don't look for a company, but look for a kind of mentor, like somebody that you would like to work under, right? So
Mm,
it's not really about the company or the product or anything. It's about the team that you work in, right? So I would, if LinkedIn is a very good source of information, obviously, and you can find people that you really respect, right? So, like, I have a couple
true.
of people that I found that I'm like, okay, these people are really, really good,
Mm,
like Matt Lerner or Ed Biden or Ben Williams or like many others, right? There's like a list of people that I really respect because they put out really good content. I think if you follow these kind of people, you can think, okay, if I could ever work with any of them, right, that
yes.
would boost my career like crazy. Because for me, I've worked with a variety of leaders, I've worked with a variety of startups. When you pick the right people, that's where you learn the most, right?
Yeah.
So I would
Yes.
look for mentors or the kind of people that you would like to work with, and try to apply for jobs like that.
That's amazing. So, how would people get in touch with you? They can always go to the Experiment Nation website or your LinkedIn account.
LinkedIn, I think, is the best bet. So feel free to find me on LinkedIn. Maybe you can hyperlink it here. My name is Elsa van der Berg. You can find me and
Hyperlink.
always reach out.
Awesome. I feel like there's a lot of things that we can talk about in your area, but we have like a certain amount of time. But I think we should have like a session number 2 in the next few months to talk about more things. And so I just want to thank you, Dr. Elsa, for this interview and for your time. Really, really, really appreciate it. And we've learned a lot. Again, like, I feel like we're just scratching the surface with this interview. And I really do think that there should be a second session. So up to you once you're available by then. Get in touch with us again. And thank you so much again for your time.
I will do that. Thank you so much for having me. I had a blast. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Hi, this is Romo Santiago from Experiment Nation. If you'd like to connect with hundreds of experimenters from around the world, consider joining our Slack channel. You can find the link in the description. Now back to the episode.